Okay, so you've identified a shaper that's got experience shaping higher volume shortboards. The next step, one of the first conversations you're going to have, an early conversation, is going to be about the volume of the board you're riding. Again, I think there's varying opinions on volume. It's a very personal thing. Some people completely stick to their guns and always have a set volume. Before they do anything else, they get the volume of the board and stick by it. That's one end of the spectrum. Another opinion, the far end of that spectrum, is people who completely ignore volume and just take the dimensions of the board into account, the template, the foil, which is how the foam's distributed. They take all that into account and think that makes much more difference than the volume, so they completely ignore it. So I've experimented with volume myself quite a lot, and I've kind of moved between those two camps, and I kind of find myself somewhere in the middle now. So the reason for that is, I think as well, a big factor is the overall design of the board and what the board's going to be used for. So as an example of that, this is my current performance shortboard. This is 40 litres. My daily driver, which is kind of a step down for this, for average UK waves, from kind of waist high up to a bit overhead, mushy waves. So that board, the daily driver, is 43 litres, so that's 3 litres different. So this is 3 litres less than my daily driver. And again, the reason I've got the volume in there is to generate more speed on the wave, basically, and get into the wave a little bit easier as well. And again, going the other end of this, so stepping up from this to a step up for when we rarely get solid waves here, or if I'm ever on a surf trip abroad, my step up as well has got similar kind of difference in volume. So again, it goes up to 43 litres. The reason for that, for me, as a step up, is I'm not going to be doing the same kind of performance manoeuvres on solid waves as I am on a kind of good pumping waves. So when it gets to a certain size, it's more about survival for me. I'm more doing open face turns. So I'm going to sacrifice adding a bit more volume to get a bit more paddle power, and I also want the stability when I'm kind of paddling in and making a drop. I'd rather have the stability and confidence of having a bit more foam under my feet. So yeah, different volumes depending on what board you're riding. Interestingly, with grovel boards, my understanding was before, and a lot of people have said, you want more volume in your grovel board, again to help you paddle in and just give you more float on the wave. I had a kind of a theory that I wanted a lot less length in my grovel boards. I thought it would just fit into the pocket a lot easier, and I'd be willing to sacrifice the volume to come down in length. So I've experimented with both really. I've had high volume grovel boards, but because you need to pack the volume in somehow for someone who needs more volume, I always find my grovel boards end up feeling too long, and they're usually above 6 foot. So now I've started to cut down on volume. I experimented with one which was, I think, about 37 litres or something, which is 3 litres less than my, my performance good wave board. But the reduced length actually I found felt really good, and it was fine paddling into the wave. So I'm now dropping down the length of my grovel boards and therefore the volume. But again, it's all a personal thing, but you just need to kind of have some idea in your head of what kind of volume you're gonna want, and trying to match that up with what kind of waves you'll be riding in. Next thing you're going to want to look at is more specifically at the dimensions. Obviously a lot of this will come from your shaper, but it does help to go in with some knowledge of how the dimensions of the board are going to affect the performance of the board. So I've kind of mentioned length already. In a grovel board, for me, I want as less length as I can so it fits into the pocket. Big guys, big people really struggle getting any kind of performance out of a small wave. It's really hard to generate speed in smaller waves, and I just find with a shorter board it just fits into the pocket nicer and you can get in the pocket and generate the speed more. That's my opinion. But yeah, so length for me, when you get up to kind of more punchy solid waves, so you're getting around head high, you can start to add a bit more length. But I find And in my experience, and I've ridden, you know, boards designed for performance waves that have been too long, and what I find in that instance is it's hard to get the board round. So if you're doing kind of top turns, re-entries, or even on the open face, you're just going to have more wider drawn out turns on the face, or it's just harder to get round to do those re-entries on a long board, on a longer board. So add the length. You've got to get the volume in there somehow, so you've got to kind of accept that you're going to have a bit more length as a bigger person, but you get to a certain point where it's too much length. So as from personal experience, I'm about 105 kilos, this is 40 litres this board, and this is 6'6". So I generally wouldn't want to go any longer than 6'6". Ideally I'd like to be a bit shorter if I could, but to get the volume in there, you've got to kind of accept that it's got to go in somehow. So for me, it's around 6'6". For performance waves, you know, you might have a different opinion there. So then you've got two more dimensions to consider. Overall, you've got the width and you've got the thickness of the board as well. So again, that's the thickness. So again, you've got if you overcompensate on either of those, it's going to have a negative effect again. So you've got to get the volume in there somehow, but if you go too wide, for example, like through the length of the board, if you've got too much width, it's going to make it really hard to go rail to rail on the board. So some shapers try and counteract that with quite an aggressive V in the bottom of the board. So that's imagine the board kind of pointing up like that. It's a bottom shape of the board. But what I found is I've had a surfboard that was really wide, it was 23. It had quite extreme V running quite a long way along the board, but what I found was if I was coming to do a top turn, re-entry, I'd find myself stuck on the rail that I'd just done the turn on, and instead of the board coming down flat, because of the V in the bottom of the board, I'd kind of be stuck on the rail. So if I did a kind of forehand re-entry, I'd kind of be stuck on my heels almost. So, you know, there are ways to counteract the width, but for me, you're just better off not getting too much width in the board. So from my experience, it's around, you know, if you're going above 22, 22 and a half, when you start to get to about 23, if you want some performance, for me that's getting to be too much. And I can really feel it as well. This is my performance shortboard, this is 20 and a half, so my daily driver is around 22 I think, maybe just a fraction more. I think it might be 22.13. Anyway, it's a lot wider than this, and although it's a lot more stable, that's a positive to having the width in there. You've got a lot more stability, but I can feel it rail to rail. This feels much easier to kind of do those turns on from one rail to another. So that's another thing to take into account basically. You've got to get the volume in there somehow, but if you get too much width, it's going to have a negative effect on the performance. Again, as well, as I mentioned, I had a custom board, and the width, there was width in the centre of the board, not too much width, but to get the volume in there, the width was carried through the tail and the nose of the board, and for me that affected the performance as well. So you've got to think of the overall width in specific areas as well. So one last dimension to think about is the thickness of the board. So this can have different effects. For me, the real trick with a lot of shapers that are shaping really good boards, higher volume boards for people that need the volume in there, they're getting the thickness in, but the rails are really pared down. So the first boards I noticed for that were the Lost boards, but also this is the Paizel, and other boards I've tried as well. That's one of the big tricks for me, is paring the rails down. So if you've got too boxy rails, if the rails are too boxy, as you make a turn, the rails aren't going to bite, and it's going to be more of a drawn out open turn, and you're just not going to get that real snappiness that you want. Obviously if you want a bit more of a drawn out turn, then you might want to you know, bring a bit more of that volume out to the rail. But for me, if I'm, you know, what I'm talking about here is performance shortboards for really good waves. So for me, I want the rails to be really pared down. And as I said, the example I gave earlier of the board I had shaped had really boxy rails, and it just didn't work. So that might be part of the reason the board didn't work, was the boxy rails. Talking about thickness as well, when you're talking about thickness, you need to talk about the foil of the surfboard. So what that means is how the foam is distributed. So again, I've got this example because this is a really good example of really good distribution of foam. So it's all in the right places where you need it. So a lot of the foam here is under the chest of the surfboard. And then where you need less foam for performance, it's been really nicely foiled out. So you can see there, it's really thinned out along the tail. It's quite thinned out towards the nose, not as much so, but there's definitely a lot less volume, thickness in the nose and the tail of the board than there is under the chest. So really good foil distribution is really going to help the performance of your board.